This episode of CelloChat is brought to you by Carriage House of Johnson String Instrument. Please visit us at www.carriagehouseviolins.com.
And we're now live.
All right. So, well, thank you, Isaac, so much. And thank you to Cello Bello for having me. I guess what I'll do is I'll just kind of start off today with a little bit about myself, just so in case you don't know who I am, and then we'll dive right into our topic. So my name is Billy Tobenkin. I'm a cellist and a teacher, educator, and I specialize in teaching adult learners. I myself was an adult learner of the cello, so I started at age 25 from scratch. And yeah, I just got super obsessed with it very early on. I ended up going back to school for cello, and I did a second bachelor's degree in cello performance at Cal State Northridge. And then during that school time and for a little bit of a few years afterwards, I was able to study with a couple truly like world-class teachers, which was extremely helpful as well. And now I basically just focus on teaching adult learners because it's what I think I can contribute to this world of cello playing, because I think I have particular insight into, what it's like to learn as an adult, this wonderful but very difficult instrument. And that's, when I started. And I should mention also that where I'm tuning in from, normally I would be doing this from my home in Los Angeles, but I'm actually here in Leeds in the UK. Because I'm almost exactly halfway through a one-year master's program at the University of Leeds. It's a master's in music and well-being. So I've kind of gone back to school, and I'm just checking out, trying to deepen my understanding of adult learning and the concept of well-being, and from the learner side, from the teacher side, and how we can increase the sense of well-being and increase, kind of stoke the passion for learning this instrument. So that's something I've been doing. If you're interested in that kind of subject matter, you could always, if you haven't signed up for my newsletter, my website is adultcello.com, and I've been doing kind of regular newsletters to share things I've been learning and articles I found interesting, that kind of stuff. So that's interesting. That's something you could look into. All right, so let's just go ahead and start on vibrato for adult learners. Okay, so I'm thrilled to talk about this today because I can say, with complete transparency, that vibrato was by far and away the most difficult thing for me on my cello journey. I always feel like there's the cello journey, and then there's these little sub-journeys within. And that was the absolute hardest thing for me to finally feel, okay, I can vibrate, I can widen my vibrato, I can speed it up, slow it down, I can do it in different parts of the cello, I feel fine. So that's kind of what I want to talk about today. And what we're going to do, I wrote a blog kind of in preparation for this CelloChat for Cello Bello, and it's from June of this year. And in it, I kind of talk about how I think for adult learners, you really need kind of two avenues or two sets of exercises you're going to work on if you're going to tackle vibrato. The first is your basic vibrato exercises, so you can just kind of basically learn what your finger and arm and what everything needs to do to create vibrato. But then on the other side, I think there need to be exercises and at least considerations for physical tension and for ergonomics. And that's because this is why it was so hard for me, I think. There's a lot of cello playing aspects that you can actually accomplish despite having excess physical tension. For example, you can have an overly tight bow grip or bow hold, whatever you want to call it. But it can be, just far too tense, but you could still play. You could still play maybe even movements of a sonata, it's not comfortable or recommended, but you could do it. Same with the left hand. You could get through passage work with way too much physical tension. It's, again, not recommended, but it's possible. What I found with vibrato was that, in a sense, it almost functions as a test for physical tension, because if you have excess physical tension, it's basically going to funnel all of your efforts into what I call hummingbird vibrato, which is, you probably, from the name you can imagine, but, that kind of sound that plagued me so frequently, where there was tension in places probably all over my body, honestly, when I was playing. And because of that, I just couldn't widen my vibrato. I couldn't do anything. And I was very frustrated with it. So what I've got lined up for today is I want to introduce 2 exercises for you that I would recommend. And this is what I would recommend to someone who's just starting to work on vibrato, and also an adult learner who has a quote unquote working vibrato but isn't very happy with it. Maybe it's kind of littered with physical tension. And we're going to look at those and then also talk about kind of physical tension and ergonomic considerations with each of those exercises. And what these 2 exercises will also do is highlight a very important dichotomy that I see in learning how to vibrate, which is what I call kind of the hinge versus the motor. Okay. And so when you do these kind of exercises that work on, say, like your finger flexibility, to me, that's hinge. Okay. And if you imagine like a swinging door, let's say the door is a little stuck, and then you notice the hinges are not oiled, and it's stiff and it's hard to use. And then you oil the hinges. Okay. And now the door is swinging freely, which is great. But that doesn't mean that you push on the hinges to make the door swing. Okay. So that is that. Okay. And then the other thing is the motor. Okay. And the motor is the actual forearm pumping. Okay. And so you need to really highlight the difference between those 2, because what happened to me is I was working so much on my fingers and trying to get those knuckles to, get flexible and all these things. And then I realized at a certain point I could do all the exercises, but then when I went to play and actually, apply this in my playing, it wasn't happening. And part of it was that I was so kind of in my fingers, I was sort of treating these hinges as the motor. And that was a big source of confusion for me. Okay. So that's kind of why I wanted to mention that. So now let me just go ahead and bring our first exercise that we'll work on. This is going to be with a tennis ball, and this is motor. Okay, so we're going to talk about the fingers and the hinge aspect second. So we'll start with the motor. And I think the tennis ball is incredible, partly because it kind of allows you to get out of your fingers. And also what I hope to show you today is there's ways to work on your vibrato with the tennis ball to actually work on your ergonomics and physical tension. Okay, so what I'm going to do, I'm just going to put, we have to switch on our original sound here. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to play maybe like a G. Okay, and so this would be like step 1, is learning how to sink passive weight into the string with the tennis ball. Okay, which it's not super hard, but there are some considerations I would take into account. So the first is that when I'm doing this, I'm trying to channel, like I said, passive weight. So I'm not squeezing the tennis ball with my fingers or my thumb. Okay, I'm using kind of like this first row of knuckles here and a little bit of the palm. Okay, and I'm just kind of like damping my hand and trying to find the perfect angle to just kind of like pin the tennis ball to the strings. Okay, so I should be able to get to a place where I can, play a note comfortably, and my fingers and thumb are basically just like totally relaxed, totally limp. That alone should be somewhat educational if you're one of these people like I was, where you kind of have that pinching tendency that's so common, where the thumb is pushing into the back of the neck and the fingers are, over squeezing onto the fingerboard. So you start like this. Okay, now that feels pretty comfortable. Now, another way to test for physical tension, let's look at my elbow. So So what I'm doing there probably looks a little weird, but what I'm trying to do is maintain a nice passive weight that's pinning the tennis ball to the string, but lifting my elbow up and down without affecting the pitch or my ability to like have that passive weight in the hand. What I found, and this is in a lot of it is in response to my own journey, where I would have kind of a position for vibrato, and it actually probably didn't look that bad, but what was going on is I just had this like concrete elbow that was really, really tense, even if it like positionally didn't look terrible. And so being able to create this kind of like feather light elbow, but retain that passive weight in the hand. That's very, very helpful, very important. Okay. Okay, so now let's go ahead and try something else. Okay, so we're going to take this and we're going to go ahead now and move to a couple different places on the fingerboard. So I went an octave up to the G. Same idea here, but what I want to feel is, what does it take to pin the tennis ball to the fingerboard? When I'm at this G, I have one sort of sensation of the angle that I sink my passive weight in, and then when I get to this higher G, it definitely feels different. And this is, I think, one of those things where the more you experiment, it's probably easier to feel it for yourself than for me to try to describe exactly the difference I feel. But, it's maybe here I feel a little bit more of, it's basically going to be perpendicular to the fingerboard. So I feel like I'm coming down at this angle, and there it's more like, coming like maybe across just a little bit more. So it's just a slightly different, a different angle of approach for sinking weight in passively. But I think that's very helpful, because what happens a lot of times is you just tell yourself the wrong thing that you should be feeling, and then you kind of expect a certain feeling. But this tennis ball you can use to kind of figure out, okay, how does my arm want to like approach sinking weight in? What would be the most ergonomic way? Then the other thing you could do, so we were here, you could go, let's just say like a C natural. And this is, kind of like first position-ish. And again, what does it take to pin the tennis ball? Here it feels much more like kind of vertical, and like it's kind of moving towards my face. So it's a very different arm position. And a different way of sinking weight in, I feel. Okay? So you can do that different, like, basically anywhere along the fingerboard. And I think that's very helpful. Then the next thing, now let's start bringing some vibrato in, okay? So we'll go back to G. I'm gonna pick this. What I would do with vibrato in general is, if you're learning how to vibrate, start with the thing that feels most comfortable for you. I'm doing this because I think into the camera, it's probably like the best angle and the most visible, but you could, you don't have to start on a G natural, for example. So what we do now, very simply, is we have our note that we're going to play, and we're just going to rock back and forth to create a slow vibrato. Okay, so basically what I'm not doing here is I'm not like polishing the string with the ball. Okay, I'm literally rolling the ball back and forth. Okay, so it's not like it's sliding. I'm not like holding onto the ball and sliding it like this. It's literally rolling back and forth. And then while you do this new motion, new step, go ahead and tease that elbow a tiny bit. I'm just moving it just slightly, but I'm just trying to check to make sure that when I started this new step of kind of having that oscillation with the tennis ball, that I didn't instantly get like a stiff elbow, because now, okay, let me hold myself in place because I'm doing something new. Okay, so that would be the next step. And you could do that like anywhere on the, and I would encourage you to like do it in different places to feel what it feels like. So if you're back here, again, I pick C natural. I feel much more like the rolling motion feels more vertical to me. I don't know. It's hard to describe these things because we're like 3 dimensions and everything's kind of at an angle because the cello is slanted. But the rolling motion feels more vertical to me. Okay, here it feels a little more like at an angle. So I guess one thing you could look at would be the row of my knuckles. So here, if you look at my knuckles, they're probably somewhat parallel with the string itself. Okay, kind of going up and down. When you get to the G, suddenly my knuckles are a little more crooked, like a little not parallel. And then if we come all the way up to where we were before at the high G, that's super fascinating to me because I feel like the higher I go up, my hand is open, my arm is like opening up more. And so now it feels much more like my natural thing my arm wants to do to create vibrato is actually it feels much more kind of across the strings in this way. Then here maybe feels like this, and this feels like this a little bit. So the tennis ball is absolutely wonderful for also figuring out like what your arm actually wants to do in certain parts of the fingerboard. Okay, and that was something that definitely was like a light bulb for me, because I realized I was especially higher up, I wasn't thinking about going across the strings. It was more kind of like kind of like a lower neck position up high, and that was limiting my vibrato and also very uncomfortable. And then, so now the final step for this motor exercise, I'm going through this quickly because I want to share as much as I can, but this is like super speed in terms of the learning process. So each of these steps could be done for days, and so it's not just like a one sitting, let me just run through 1, 2, 3. It might be, that'd be great if it is for you, but at least for me it wasn't. Now the final thing we can do to work on vibrato for this motor section is I'm gonna go ahead and do a vibrato exercise with a metronome, okay? And I think that's super, super helpful. So what I have the metronome on 57 here. Let me turn it up. And you can put the metronome, I would say my guidelines would be anywhere from like say 45 beats per minute to 60, okay? And I'm gonna change bow every 2 clicks, and then I'm just gonna slowly speed up the number of oscillations per beat. That probably sounds complicated. Let me just demonstrate and you'll see exactly what I'm talking about. Okay, there's our metronome. Okay, and away we go. Here we go. Okay, so that's probably harder than it looks to control, but it also highlights something with the motor aspect of this that I think is super important, too important for me not to mention before we go on to the hinge exercise. So, and that's the concept of like walking versus jogging versus running, okay? Because this is another huge source of physical tension, is not making the transition that I'm about to describe. So when you're doing the slow vibrato oscillation, you can think of that as kind of like walking, maybe you're at a beach and there's like some of those sharp rocks, and you're nice slow walk, and you're actually looking down as you talk to someone maybe, and you're actually picking your steps. Like, ooh, I don't want to step right there. That looks like one of those sharp rocks. Let me step there. And you can actually literally pick your spots for where your feet are going to go if you're moving slow enough. Okay? And so when I'm doing this slow oscillation, it really does feel like I'm basically controlling every millimeter, and I'm really measuring it in kind of, not in a stiff way, but just it's very like measured and controlled. Then at a certain point, you'll kind of hit what's like a jogging, which actually for me can be the most uncomfortable. So 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3 at this tempo. That to me is like not quite running, not quite walking. And so what that translates to physically is it's a little too fast to fully control like millimeter by millimeter, like I was saying for the walking speed. And it just feels a little too slow to start grouping and pulsing for the running speed. Okay, so that it's worth working on, I think, because it takes a very interesting kind of relaxed, slow pulse to do that. So when I say pulse, I'm thinking in threes, but I'm trying to give a pulse on every the first of every group of three. So 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. And that's how you can start speeding a physical motion up without getting tight. If you started thinking of like the entire rocking motion, 1 and 2 and 3 and 1 and 2 and 3, and you can imagine if you're trying to control that, maybe at that speed it's doable. It's probably already going to start to tighten up your arm a little bit to control like that. And then forget it when you get to the faster speeds, which is what we'll talk about now. So that's the running. Okay, so for the running, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. So I'm pulsing and I'm grouping my motions every 4. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. If you maybe think of like knocking on a door, tuck, 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 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. I'm not even thinking about back versus forward anymore. It's just each pulse, each entire oscillation is grouped in like groups of 4. Ba, 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 ba. And then 6, even more so. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So I'm thinking da 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 ba 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 ba. So that I think was something that when I started to really feel that pulsing, that really helped me speed up the vibrato without tightening up. I would sometimes get it, and then sometimes I'd start to speed up, and then I would hit like a hitch, and I'd have to like force my way through. And it was because I was, kind of power walking my way into a run. And so there was just a point where like the gates of walking and running are different. So it would just have this really awkward section. Okay. So I think that's kind of a multi-leveled step thing you can do with a tennis ball that will help you with the motor part of vibrato. And it will also, if like from those earlier parts of the exercise, will also allow you to kind of investigate what your arm wants to do, what it wants to feel. And that is very helpful for, kind of problem solving physical tension. Okay. Now let's go ahead and move now to the hinge aspect. Okay. So with the hinge, which is like kind of the finger flexibility, the best exercise for that is what I call them finger like pullbacks, is just what I call them. And essentially I'll just tell you what I'm going to do and then we'll talk about it, because this is, in my experience personally and with students, this is the easiest one to go awry because there's many ways to do it incorrectly, unfortunately. All right, so here we are. Second finger I'll pick because that's the most balanced finger of the hand. I'm kind of on like a D natural, which if you want to know, that's A string. That would be like second position, second finger on D natural on the A string. And so what I'm going to do is I have like a nice curved plane finger, and I'm going to pull my entire forearm back, and that's going to straighten out the middle finger. And then it just returns. So pull back and return. Okay, so the first image, I do a lot of image stuff because I think it helps adults, because we all have a lot of life experience. You can imagine like maybe a drop of glue, not on the actual tip of the middle finger, but maybe like kind of just like at that curve of the pad of the finger. Okay, because when I pull back, the tip of the finger is actually kind of in the air because the finger has flattened out and the tip of my second finger is now facing the bridge. Okay, but there's a drop of glue so that if there wasn't a drop of glue, I'd pull back and my finger would just kind of keep going. Okay, so that's what you think is one drop of glue, the rest of the finger very, very loosey-goosey, but the drop of glue is what holds your place. Okay, now let's do a little side angle here, and let's talk about what we are trying to do and what we're not trying to do. So let's see if I can be as helpful as possible here. So when I want you to look at my forearm here. So when I pull back, the entire forearm is moving. Okay? That's, sorry, it's like cutting off blood supply. Okay. The entire forearm's moving, and the entire forearm pulls back, and that's why the finger gets long, and then it returns. What it's not is me just kind of pushing down my own finger like this. Yes, the finger's flattening, but if you look at my forearm, nothing's happening. I'm just kind of collapsing the knuckle, like just from the finger. And the other thing, most importantly, that this is not doing is it's not from the wrist like this. Okay, so this is also kind of accomplishing the goal, but it's just my wrist doing this. Okay, and for this exercise, unfortunately, the wrist can do this exercise, and you can get away with it with using the wrist. The problem is when you go from walking, you could probably do wrist, but then when you get to jogging and especially running, trying to do it from the wrist is not going to work. Okay, so you need a forearm back. You know what I think about actually is there's those, if you go like an Asian market and you go to the register, and sometimes they'll have like a little cat made out of either plastic or metal, and it's like the good luck cat, and it has the one paw that does this, waving to people. That's actually a really good image for what your arm needs to be doing for this vibrato exercise. So like the elbow is pretty still, and it's just the forearm going backwards and forth. So back and return, back and return. Okay. Another little thing to think about is that helped me when I'm, let's say I'm in this kind of backwards place where I've pulled back. I don't think about like grinding my finger forward or like pushing my finger forward. The image I think of is, if you've ever seen those clowns that are made out of like a kind of a plastic balloon type, and they're weighted at the bottom, so you hit the clown in the head and it hits the floor and then it just kind of comes back. That's kind of the image I think of for the return. It just kind of returns on its own. So it's a kind of a passive return. So you pull back and then it just returns again. Pull back, return. Pull back, return. Forearm, not wrist. Okay? And this, like, just looking in the camera when I was doing this to prepare for this little talk, it really hits home how easy it is to kind of not do this right, because you have to really be careful because it's a deceptively small motion. I mean, if you think about your finger going from bent to straight, I'm not talking about my forearm moving 4 or 5 inches. It's just a little motion, and what the forearm moving back and forth maybe an inch and a half versus the wrist turning that if you're not very careful, you can easily kind of convince yourself you're doing it from the forearm when in fact you're doing it from the wrist. Okay? And just I thought about it. Why the wrist doesn't work is that eventually, like I said, you're gonna need to rely on the motor. okay, for like a regular speed vibrato, okay? That's like anything above a jog, okay? And your vibrato is pumping usually basically parallel, especially back here in the lower neck. It's kind of pumping parallel to the strings. And if you're using your wrist to do this, there's probably a little bit of like a twist or kind of over the top with the finger or around like this pronation supination kind of turning. And so now you're doing this motion and you've got like this weird kind of turn, and so it gets caught because you have like two separate planes that are trying to work at the same time. Okay, so now and we talked only about second finger. You can do first finger and third finger also. You can also do fourth finger. If there's time, I'll talk about fourth finger because that's kind of the strangest finger to work on vibrato. So let me just continue with what I would do with second finger, and then also with first and third finger, and then fourth finger is kind of like its own little friend that has its own stuff. So now, how do we work on tension, like less physical tension? There's a great exercise that I learned that really helps with this, and I think you can take that exercise and incorporate it with something I unfortunately never did when I was, kind of moving along my cello journey. But so if you have this kind of pinching tendency, which so many of us do, the exercise would be, so if you're gonna play that same D that we were on in a second position with second finger on the A string, you could turn it into a harmonic. Okay, just in case you didn't know that, that's a harmonic. You're just basically touching, instead of sinking all the weight in, you just touch the string there, and it'll create a harmonic. And then what we're gonna do is slowly sink weight in until we get that D, the pitch, which means we're gonna have a big period of time where we're between a harmonic and the actual pitch we want, which means it's gonna be very scratchy and very ugly. And for this exercise, I'm asking you kindly to just sort of luxuriate in that, okay? And try your best to just not like start squeezing because, ooh, a scratchy sound, I don't want that. Okay, we actually are hunting not for the scratchy sound, but we're using it to recalibrate our senses. So I'll show you what it sounds like and looks like. Okay, so now I essentially have the note I want. My finger was not even, the string wasn't even touching the fingerboard. Okay, so that might be a revelation in itself, if it was for me when I first worked on this. So you're trying to find the minimum amount of weight you need to sink weight in and to get a tone, okay? So it's okay to have that scratchiness. And then eventually it'll just kind of like pop through, and you get the tone you want, okay? Now, what's great about that is if you're really careful with that and you're being very patient, you should also be able to kind of hit that tone without even engaging the thumb at all. So you're just kind of sinking weight in this way and not worried about the thumb at all. And then you get here. And then if you can just kind of hold whatever weight you're at, and ideally you can experiment with trying to make it so that there's a little bit of daylight between the string and the fingerboard. So it's really like on the edge of minimum viable amount. And then you can go ahead. So now we'll take that kind of pullback exercise and we'll add the bow and we'll add this kind of flex. So we start from this like very reduced physical tension area. And then and I really recommend just one oscillation, nice and controlled, because if you start trying to turn it into vibrato, I think patience is the name of the game for this kind of stuff. So maybe you start. Let's say you're just going to start by adding your regular, approach to the left hand, and you're going to do the bow. You do that a few times, and then you're like, okay, let me now do that recalibration exercise. Okay, now holding this new sensation, this much less physical tension. I think that is a really helpful thing, because the anytime you're working on that kind of hinge action, the more that clamping comes into play, it's just going to kind of freeze up those joints that you actually are trying to work and like lubricate so that they swing freely. So that would be the exercise. So again, that's the finger pullback exercise, and then adding this nice little kind of recalibration exercise for tension, like holding down a string and playing a note. And then you do that in combination. And again, that's the hinge. So do that work, but just keep in mind that you did really good work for the hinge, and that ultimately when you go to vibrate, you'll use that hinge, but in a much more passive sense, because it's more about like the motor is sending energy through the hinge into the string. Okay, but you don't have to make the vibrato with your fingers. It's just the oscillation is going to travel through those nice flexible fingers. Okay, I think that's pretty much what I wanted to say. Just to recap what I wanted to talk about today, as like a takeaway, I would really try to do some vibrato exercises, also to do some nice kind of physical tension / ergonomic work, and try to marry the two, like really work on them together in tandem, and constantly reevaluate to make sure that, maybe you've been doing this one exercise for 2 minutes, 5 minutes now. Check again, because maybe you're starting to get tenser and tenser the more you're like working on it. Because we're adult learners, we're very passionate, most of us. We're also very diligent, I think. A lot of us, we're intelligent people. We want this to work. And so there's a determination there, but that can also lead to just kind of like a slowly tightening physicality as you continue working on problem solving. Okay, so here we have a question now. What's your advice for developing thumb vibrato? So I guess that question, that's kind of the person I immediately think of when I think of thumb vibrato is Daniel Schifrin, because he was I don't think I can think of another incredible artist who used as much thumb vibrato as him. I mean, for thumb vibrato, it's not easy. But what I do when I have to vibrate on the thumb is I'm thinking again of what I need from my thumb. I need my thumb to kind of rock back and forth. And so what I find is that if I sort of lean my hand open a little bit, almost like I'm waving, and then I try to really pump the forearm and like think of the fingers as like a single unit. And again, it's like, it's that's a hard one, but that's kind of my approach to doing it. And to be completely honest, I do it when that's like the only option. But if there's a way of fingering something to avoid a thumb vibrato, I think that's something I would consider a lot of times. But sometimes there's passage work in thumb position where you just need to. But yeah, that's kind of my thought on it, is that you just want to sort of like close up the fingers without tensing them, so just so that you get as much of a wiggle as possible, because if you kind of keep a hand frame, you're not going to hear as much. So I think you'll hear more of a vibrato if you kind of like really break that thumb position hand frame and try to, because you're right on, most of us are right on that bone on the side of the thumb, and so there's not a lot of meat to kind of roll back and forth. Great question. What is a good way to reduce tension in the left hand when the thumb is squeezing too much into the back of the fingerboard? That's exactly the exercise I just showed. I think that would be my number one way. So you start with that harmonic, and then and now if the thumb is like the real culprit here, which often it is, the other thing you can do, let me see, hopefully you can see me doing this, but you could do the same thing, but let's say we're going to keep the thumb hanging off. Just trying to make sure my arm doesn't block the view. So my thumb is not touching. So that's, I think, a really helpful way is you just kind of slowly creep down, figure out what that minimum amount is from the finger sinking into the string, and then you can even like sort of detach the thumb. I think sometimes that helps because there was a period where I felt like I wouldn't be able to get enough downward weight from the finger alone, which is not true, but that's definitely how it felt. And so by kind of doing that recalibration exercise with the thumb dangling, that's probably even better way to get the sensation. But then I think there's also maybe like a psychological element of trusting your finger that your finger can sink weight in without, kind of giving this like counter squeezing pressure from the thumb and the finger together. Really good question. Explain more about the motor. Yeah, so the motor is what I see is like there's like a driving force to create the vibrato. Okay, and so when you vibrate, it's, again, if I love these images, but if I just think about that cat at the supermarket, and then you imagine this motion, and then imagine, like, now let's take another image, and when you're doing the forearm rolls, like for example with the tennis ball that I did, you at a slow speed, let's say we're bouncing it kind of like bouncing it chest high, a basketball, okay? So we're bouncing a basketball chest high, dribbling slowly, 1 and 2 and 3, catch, throw with the basketball. And then as you speed your vibrato up, it's going to be kind of similar to when you start dribbling lower to the ground. Okay, so here you're like 1, 2, 1, 2, you get a low 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and now you're just dribbling really close to the ground, controlled. It's not tight, but it's just the ball is moving quickly, and it's just like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, bump, 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 bump. And I think I touched on this a little bit, but I think that's another thing with the motor that's helpful to think about, is that as you speed up, you can naturally expect that your arm motion will not be as wide as it was when it was really slow. So, and it actually would probably sound a little crazy if you've got, let's say we're here. To me, that's too wide to be, but just to make a point. Now, if I sped that up, it's at a fast speed with that big width, it sounds pretty wild, like pretty unhinged, and you also lose a pitch center, I think. So that's something to keep in mind, is that as you are, let's say, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. That's a certain speed, and then I speed up. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. When I speed up to that from the pulse, the impulse of 4 to the impulse of 6, I feel like my overall, like the motor, the width of my oscillation is less, because there's just less time to move, because you're fitting 6 wiggles or oscillations in. You're fitting 6 in where you had 4 before. So it's you'll be kind of like slower and wider, and then as things speed up, it's going to narrow a little bit. Which brings me to like another little point I was thinking about, which is that you also, something that helped me was when you get up higher, you don't have to really move as much to get the same width. And I think there's kind of like you can almost think about it mathematically. So like, let's say that's what I like right there. If I use the same thing, if I use the same width up high, it actually sounds to me a little too wide. And it's because, as you know, the cello, the intervals are bigger in the lower neck, and then just the higher you go up the fingerboard, the intervals get smaller. So let's say what our ear likes is a oscillation total width of 20 cents difference. Let's just say that's goes back and forth, and that distance of the oscillation is 20 cents of pitch. To go 20 cents of pitch down here is a certain distance, and then to go 20 cents of pitch up high is like a fraction of that, because the distance between two pitches is so much smaller. Okay, so up here, versus, so when I'm in the lower position, it's much at that speed, it's more vigorous, and up high to match to my ear what I would want the vibrato width to be, it's going to be narrower just naturally, because the intervals are so much smaller up high. I hope that helps. Hi, Billy, this is Loren. Oh, hey, Loren. Any tips on shifting vibrato from one finger to the next? Yeah, definitely. So with shifting, what I like to think of an image of like maybe those ninjas that you see on TV, or like the people who do parkour. If you notice, there'll be like a guy who runs off a building and then lands like 2 stories down on the ground. And if he just landed on his feet, he would break his legs for sure. So what they do is they like land and then they like roll forwards to kind of absorb some of the impact and go with it, instead of just like taking all the impact right on their legs. That's what I think you can think of with shifting, is you kind of want to encourage your arm to continue doing what it's doing. So what are you talking about? Let me show you. So let's say I'm starting on a B, and I'm going to go from B to F, first position to fourth position on the A string. As I go from a lower finger to a higher finger, I'm going to land, and I'm going to try to kind of like come in the lower part when I shift, and then land and roll forward. So I don't want to actually land in the forward position, because then the forward part of my oscillation, because then I don't have anywhere to go with that. And if you're moving your body forward in the shift, and then you try to pull back immediately, that's awkward, because your energy is going this way, and then you're like instantly hitting the brakes. So I would slide with my hand kind of in a backwards position, like this, and then I would land and allow that momentum of the shift to roll. And backwards is the opposite. So let's take the same shift and go backwards. Now I'm going back, and I'm going from a higher finger to a lower finger, from second finger to first finger. What I'm going to try to do is shift and then kind of like reveal that first finger and pull back in the direction of the shift. So it's back this way. And I think that's changing fingers. I think kind of the same thing. So you kind of want to, like, if you're going from a lower finger to a higher finger, it's and you that going from 1 to 2, if you can incorporate that into the continuous vibrato, that will help a lot, versus like you go from 1 to 2 and then you think, okay, backwards, and you try to like land and change the momentum of what your hand was just doing, if that makes sense. So you could do same with 1 3. So those, you're kind of like moving in the direction of the shift, and then you'd land and kind of continue the momentum that you just had. I think that's, and then for the, on the way back, you kind of like reveal the finger and pull back because you were just moving backwards. So I hope that helps. Let's see, how to prevent your finger from sliding. I try to put weight on it without pressing, but it's difficult. Great question. Okay, so I had that a little bit. I think what that is your arm is not balanced. So that's part of kind of this, like with maybe the tennis ball, finding the right position, having a nice like relaxed elbow feeling, and a nice, you want to, when you're vibrating a finger, you want that finger to feel very centered in terms of your weight. Okay, and this is, there are so what's so tough about fielding questions about cello playing? Like I just thought of like probably 5 instances which would be like where you don't do that. But in general, if you're playing, you're vibrating on a note, the ideal thing would be to be completely centered on the note you're playing in terms of your hand and the weight of your hand. So if I'm vibrating second finger, and if I move to third finger, even my thumb, which was under second finger when I did second finger, even my thumb will tease towards third finger a little bit, because I'm really trying to transfer the weight from a balanced second finger to a balanced third finger. And I think, and then also, part of that balance is that tennis ball thing I was talking about, of having, like a nice weighted feeling of passive weight in the hand and the fingers, but having like a nice feather light. The image I use sometimes is, think of like a jug of liquid, and you pour the jug, and so as you're pouring, the weight goes into the hand and the fingers, especially into the tip of the finger would be the ultimate place, and that means that there's less liquid in the bottom of the jug, which would be the elbow. So you can imagine, like, finger gets a little heavier, elbow gets lighter, because you're just pouring that weight into the fingertip. I think for a sliding finger, that's usually what's going on, is it's kind of like, your arm is in a place where it's probably a little tense and not balanced. And so as you're shaking, you're also, some of that energy is sending the finger either up the fingerboard or down the fingerboard, instead of having it just kind of centered directly over the finger, and then you're just kind of like that tennis ball, you're just kind of like rolling. And so that brings up another thing. I think there is, there's some debate on this, but my take, what I learned and what I believe, is that when you're vibrating, you start at the pitch. Okay, that's like your neutral place, because you want to be in tune. So you start at the pitch, and then you go you dip under, and then you return to the pitch itself. There's some people who talk about vibrating over the pitch. If it sounds good, do whatever. But I think that doing the pitch, going back and returning to the pitch, is a very safe way of ensuring that you maintain a tonal center. And so that you don't end up with like under and over, and then you've got this pitch that's like kind of in the middle of this big wide oscillation. I think for the human ear, it's easier to start at the pitch, go dip under, and then return to that pitch. Okay, I hope that helps. Let's see. When and how do we transition to the faster, more natural vibrato without moving the finger, as you showed us in the exercise? Now, thank you for that question. That's kind of like the magic question. So it's hard, because it's that what you just described is basically what I fought for so long. Was I could manually get my fingers to do the motions I talk about, and there's other exercises I learned, a whole bunch of them, and then it would be like, okay, now I just need it to like go. Okay, what I found, again, the one of the biggest ones was physical tension. I hate to, I don't know why. Sometimes it feels like almost like a cop out, like my answer, but it's the absolute truth. Is that I had like I had tightness in my elbow, like I talked about, and I had tightness. I also kind of like my lat, the back muscles. Like if you do the rowing machine, I was kind of like holding myself like that kind of feeling, and that was a big problem with making that transition because it just I just ended up having this stumbling block. So we talked about this metronome with the ball, and you do it to the metronome. Then eventually you can try, once it's comfortable, the motor exercise with the ball, you can do the same metronome with the finger. So you go okay, so you can do the same one, and that's where you kind of marry the two. And it's a hard exercise to do if you're, I think it's like riding a bike. You get the feeling, you're like, okay, now I have the feeling I can do it. But for a while, it's complicated. But that would be, I think, the ways you get really comfortable with the tennis ball first, so that you're not fighting tension in your fingers. You do the other kind of finger exercises, trying to find like a really like balanced, not tense finger, approach to like playing the actual note where you're not overly squeezing. And then you do that metronome work, and trying not to focus as much that in that metronome work that I just showed you. That's where I would start to trust the finger to be a hinge, ignore it, and focus on the arm. And then you just kind of like, hopefully it's this weird game of like staying out of your own way. And if you can just focus on the pumping of the arm and not like tighten up your body, and you can also keep like a nice balanced approach with the arm, light elbow, the heavy fingertip, everything's good, then I think you can sort of like focus on the pumping that you've worked in with the tennis ball, and that hopefully will kind of, you'll just start doing it, and your, as long as your finger doesn't like seize up, it should just sort of like, the hinge remains a hinge. That's the concept. But easier said than done. I hope it's not as much of a struggle as it was for me, but for a lot of people, it's very difficult. Let's see, what else we got here? Is there a difference in how much left hand tension squeezing is needed when you play vibrato and not? Yeah, now, this is so hard because there's so many like little, so let me just say something else. There are times when you need to add tension. Like, so for example, if I find that if I'm playing really light with like kind of a feathery, if I'm playing like a very light kind of feathery thing with the bow, I actually have to sink more weight in with the finger. So I'm not saying I have to tense my finger up, but I have to use more weight because the bow is not really supporting the sound. And if I have a light bow and a light finger, it's going to go in and out of tone because there's just nothing like supporting the, like keeping the string down, versus, so I have like, I'm kind of like forte, mezzo forte in the left hand, and like pianissimo in the right hand. And then the opposite is true too. If I have a much bolder, bigger sound, I could be like forte in the bow, and then that's when you can start thinking like mezzo forte, mezzo piano with the left hand, because that's when you can, that, which is actually kind of nice to focus on because it takes a lot of tension out. You don't have to be forte with both hands often. You don't have to be. With playing, yeah, again, it sort of changes. I think in terms of how to answer that question, I would say that you're always trying to work as efficiently as possible. Like some people, I think they joke about that being like, I just like to be lazy. But what you really are saying is you want to be efficient. So when you're playing passage work, you're finding like what is the minimum amount I need to get like whatever kind of tone I'm looking for, like crystal clear but not over squeezing. Same with vibrato. I want a really like juicy, delicious tone, but I don't want to like be over squeezing. And I think with adult learners, this is my advice in a lot of areas. If possible, once you have enough tools to kind of like problem solve, I think a big like strength for adult learners is that we are like musical people. We know what a good cello sound is. You know what I mean? It's not quite the same with sometimes kids. They don't have as much experience as we do. So we have a strength compared to a lot of kids. Not all kids, but a lot of kids, which is that we know what we want to hear and we're there on purpose. So I think using your ear and trying to hear the tone that you would want to hear in your mind, and then you can kind of play, like you have my permission to experiment with different type of like weight in different contexts, and see like, okay, well that's very comfortable, but unfortunately I have like a very fuzzy tone, so I need to change either something I'm doing with the bow or something I'm doing with the left hand, because that I don't that it's very comfortable, but I don't like the sound. Okay, that is like I have a very clear tone right now, but my left hand is screaming at me. Clearly I'm squeezing too much. So I think you can allow yourself to use your ear to like hunt, and then you can play with different lanes on the cello, different weight, different speed with the bow, and then also different kind of settings in terms of how much weight you're sinking in. And that I hope that wasn't a super specific answer, because I think it's almost impossible to be specific, because so much of that is like based on the context of what you're playing and what you want to hear. Okay, let's see what else we got. Is it true that each person has their own vibrato style? That's such a great. Oh, I was thinking about this. I love that. So mechanically, I think yes, to a degree, because I think a lot of it is going to be like, do you have big hands? Do you have small hands? Do you have big hands but short fingers? Do you have really long fingers, narrow palms? Like, there's so much variation. So mechanically, I think the way to think about it is that you're given, hopefully, if you're studying with someone, you're given really helpful guidelines and principles, and then your job with your teacher and also on your own is to figure out how those principles express themselves through your anatomy. Okay, so if you don't look like your teacher, you're on the shorter side and you have small hands, you have a teacher who's really tall, really huge hands, there's a pretty good chance, I would say, that your ideal vibrato probably won't look the exact same. It maybe will sound similar if you guys have the same taste, but it won't necessarily look the same because you have different anatomy. Then there's the question of like, what do you shoot for in a good vibrato? And to me, I was thinking of how to answer that today, in anticipation of a question like this. And I was thinking it's kind of like actors, especially the older generations, which I think people argue have more personality because it was just way less global back then. So you didn't have the internet. There wasn't all this like global comparison constantly. And so you had these like, you had countries like the German school, the French school of music, the Russian school, like all this variation. But then within vibrato, I kind of feel like there's people who are so unique. And to me, that's almost like the actor Jack Nicholson, where for me, like when I'm watching him, I kind of always know it's Jack Nicholson, but it doesn't take away from the performance. And you should be so lucky to have a movie to watch with Jack Nicholson in it. He's awesome. But you kind of know it's him when he's acting. And then there's someone like Gary Oldman, who I didn't even know who he was. I knew the name, but I didn't even know who he was because he like changes so much between each role. And to me, Jack Nicholson would be someone like Daniel Shafran, who was one of my favorite cellists, but he has like a signature vibrato that is like just very Chiffron-esque. It's signature when the adjective is just the guy's name, but I mean it's just like very easy to pick out of a lineup. And then when I think of like that actor who just morphs constantly, I think one of my favorite vibratos is actually Yo-Yo Ma. But I can't describe it. I have no idea because it's just like it just is perfect always. But it changes constantly. It's like, is it wide? I don't know. Show me different clips of him playing. It's all over the place, and it's just like something that's constantly evolved, and it's just like constantly changes to the context of the music making. And I think these days I would argue that there's there's more consensus on what vibrato should be, which is, you can argue whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. I think older recordings, it's maybe a little easier to tell different players' vibratos. What I would say that I shoot for, I actually don't think about whether I want my vibrato to be fast or to be slow. What I want it to do is to enhance the sound. And the best way to do that for me is to really focus on matching my left hand and what it's doing to what my right hand's doing. So it's like you've seen those people do like a exercise where they do kind of a crescendo, like something like that, where it's the bow, as the bow increases and grows, so does the vibrato to match it. That's just what I think now when I think of vibratos. I just want it to enhance the line I'm carving with the bow. And so when I say enhance, I think what that means is it basically releases more overtones. So it's the right width and the right speed for whatever my bow is doing, and it complements my bow. And that's to me what I think of. So I don't know if that would even count as like a style versus like a guideline. So it just kind of would depend on my bow. That's a ranging answer. I hope that helps that question. It's a great question though. Hi Billy, Katinka here. I find it very difficult to get the bow into vibration. Without it, it's sort of okay, but there's an exercise to do with the bow. Yeah, so if you're talking about the two arms working together, this was something Hans Jensen showed me that was so helpful. So part of my problem, another problem I had, one of many when it comes to vibrato, was that at one point I had kind of a vibrato motion that was somewhat reliable, but it wasn't synced up to my bow like I was just talking about. So I was just kind of, they were like talking, my two hands were talking at each other, but not with each other. Okay, and so it's actually almost hard for me to recreate because I trained it out of out of me so diligently. But the exercise is you're gonna just do a pulse of 4, ba 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 ba, ba 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 ba. So you start with it in the kind of back motion, and you go 1 2 3 4. So forward, ba 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 ba, 1 2 3 4. And in the bow, you're thinking 1 2 3 4, 1 2 3 4, and you literally take the bow off. So it's you could do 6 da 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 da. And what helped me so much was that I was doing the left hand grouping, but I was also thinking the grouping in my bow arm. And so it got the two hands to kind of think together. So 1 2 3 4 5 6, 1 2 3 4 5 6, ba da 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 da, ba da 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 da. And that was that little kind of simple exercise just totally unlocked this understanding of like, oh, okay, they like, you focus so much on right hand, left hand independence, which is very important, but then you have to it all loops back together and it comes full circle, and then you have two independent hands that work together completely. And that's where it was breaking down for me, and it might be kind of what you're talking about, Katinka. Okay, it looks like I have a final question here. How would you explain the arm-hand balance for controlled vibration in upper positions when you can't move your thumb to rebalance under the given note. For instance, a note like B. Oh, I see. So yeah, I mean, yeah, I see what you're saying, because it's a little cramped if you're like, for example, you're holding the, I think if I'm reading this correctly, you're saying in a situation maybe where you like have to hold the thumb in that thumb position area, and so you've got it really kind of like it's everything's a little cramped, versus like if you had your thumb back a little further, it would be easier to wiggle. What I would do for my hand is I think I would actually kind of collapse this knuckle a little bit. So this might not be a solution if you have hypermobility, because I think I'm very non-hypermobile, so this is not a problem for me. But what I find is that if I was just on the fingertip, which is normally kind of how I would contact the string in that kind of thumb position, I could vibrate, but I can't get much width because I'm just on the tip. There's like just, it's almost like a stiletto high heel versus like a flat. There's just not a lot of surface area to play with. So if I collapse my knuckle a little more, I think I can get a little bit more width. And then also making sure that I'm like from the tennis ball exercise, that I'm actually pumping in the right direction. So I could see myself almost pumping like up and down the string if I think about my past, and like it would be much narrower, because I'm kind of like, I'm thinking this instead of this. So if I think in the right direction, I get a wider vibrato, and it's also much more comfortable. So I think that's what I would look at is, maybe playing around with the part of the finger pad that you're using, and then also checking maybe with the tennis ball just to make sure that you're actually, you're pumping, that motor is pumping in the ideal direction in the first place. And I think that would hopefully help with that. All right, well, I think that's the final question. To all you who tuned in, thank you so much. Thank you for wonderful questions. I really hope this helps. Feel free to email me. My email is billy@adultcello.com if you have any other questions. And yeah, thank you to Cello Bello for hosting this.